All right, I think we are live and recording. So welcome everyone to our webinar today. We're going to be covering the proverbial question of build versus buy, this time applying to a permission system. And we will jump into it. So for the agenda today, we're going to do some brief introductions, and then we're going to talk about rolling your own permission system versus adopting SpiceDB. And then we'll move into self-hosting SpiceDB versus an offset managed solution. And then we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. If you have questions in the middle of our conversation, feel free to ask a question using the question functionality in Livestorm, or you can chat and we'll be able to see and respond as we go. So first, I will introduce Offset. Offset is the company that develops SpiceDB and manages the community. And just as a blurb about some of the background in Offset, and one of our founders and Chief Product Officer, Jimmy, is here, and I'll let him introduce himself further.
Hey everyone, I'm Jimmy. Thanks for the quick summary, Sam. Yeah, I am one of the co-founders. I have a background kind of in cloud software development, really kind of cut my teeth in the space when I started to work at a company called CoreOS, which ultimately became a founding member of the CNCF, and I kind of contributed to a bunch of the foundational projects there. I'm a maintainer of OCI, which is the standard for container images, and I've just kind of continued to innovate there. CoreOS got acquired by Red Hat, where I was a product leader in OpenShift. And then eventually we left Red Hat to found Offset when we realized that no one was moving the needle on authorization, and there is still a huge market opportunity there. Sam, you want to give yourself an intro?
Yep. So I am a software engineer here at Offset. I was the first employee, so I've had the benefit of seeing SpiceDB and our accompanying products get off the ground and evolve. And then previously, I've been at some big companies, so I've seen some authorization challenges that some enterprise products go through, as well as been able to consult with a lot of startups to see the other end of the spectrum, which is seeing new, smaller teams kind of tackle authorization and permissions in their products. So that is my kind of background in getting into this space. Okay, so jumping right into our first question of build versus adopt. Just out of curiosity, I think we're going to throw out a poll, but we want to gauge kind of where people are at in their journey with this problem. So if you have used SpiceDB or something else to start tinkering, I think we're going to throw up a poll. So it'd be cool to see where people are at in their journey. But we'll start with actually, what do you get from SpiceDB? So if you choose to adopt a permission solution, what are the things that you get? So high level, we're going to focus on these 5 high level things that you automatically get. So scalability, performance, flexibility, ecosystem, and community. One interesting thing is if we had arranged it a little bit differently and could come up with a better synonym for flexibility that started with the I, we would have had Spice, which would have been really, really convenient, but didn't quite get that. So first, scalability. By adopting SpiceDB, you get this, you get scalability in these dimensions. So you get Google Zanzibar, which is Google's internal authorization solution and service. And SpiceDB is designed and architected to meet Google scale. And part of that is you have consistency that can be configured per request. And if you haven't read the paper, it goes into detail about why that is important. But scalability is at the core of SpiceDB's design. And Jimmy, feel free to come in and add any additional details or anecdotes as you see fit.
Yeah, I think scalability is a really interesting kind of focus, because a lot of people always think of scalability as the idea of like handling how many requests per second or like really serving tons of traffic. But there's a lot of different ways you can scale software. And we'll cover more of those things when we talk about maybe like the ecosystem and other aspects of SpiceDB. But you can scale software in a bunch of different ways. This one's kind of focusing more on traffic, but you could also scale to different geo. Say you're trying to introduce your product into a new market over the ocean. You could scale on the number of features that you can actually support in a product. You could scale on the development velocity of actually developing those features of the product. So I think that a lot of people really can look at this and say, well, we're not serving tons of traffic, but actually SpiceDB is handling scale in a bunch of these other dimensions that you may actually be suffering from.
Cool. And next is performance. Again, the Google Zanzibar paper does a good job of highlighting the overall, I guess, performance numbers, but actually breaks down kind of what performance means and why it's applicable to the eventual application experience that this kind of performance supports. And so kind of one indicator is just that you can have these single millisecond response times at a very high request rate and at, utilizing billions of relationships that are used to compute some of these authorization questions. So yeah, again, there's a lot to unpack here, but for now, we'll just call it is very performant. And there are a lot of tunable knobs that you can optimize specific to your application. Yep. Flexibility. So sometimes flexibility and performance don't necessarily go hand in hand, because a lot of times you have to be rigid in your design in order to gain the performance and the scalability that your application requires. But in this case, SpiceDB, again, modeled after Zanzibar, has, and then augmented, has the ability to really support complex permissions that are up to your purview. You get to design and define the permissions that you need. And so we've highlighted a few things here. There's a lot of acronyms, and if you're new to the authorization space, they may be a little tricky. We cover them a lot in our blog, but there are things that we can follow up with if you have questions about those. But the other interesting aspect is that SpiceDB adds additional functionality on top of Google Zanzibar, which is once you have permissions in place, you can query for very, I guess, seemingly simple, but actually quite challenging questions like, what can this person access and who has access to this thing? So that, actually, Jimmy, you might be able to answer this better, but why that's significant.
Yeah, I think that's really significant because it unlocks a lot of different use cases that usually the homegrown systems are never accounting for, like having a place to audit or query to see if something is wrong or unexpected in the system. Usually folks just implement kind of like their own ad hoc unit tests around whatever kind of system they built, and then they kind of pray that they get it right. But by actually having these queries, you can use our command line tool, for example, and inspect a live system to see if it's giving you what you expect out of it. Yeah, just on the topic of overall flexibility, I think if you're handwriting one of these systems, you could say, I have infinite flexibility, right? But I actually think that by using a tool like SpiceDB, the schema language we give you to define these models can actually help guide you towards maintaining that flexibility while also implementing it in a more performant way. And we even have things like linting in our schema language. If you're using the VS Code extension, that can give you tips for patterns to avoid or patterns that you should be using when you're actually modeling this stuff to make sure you're getting the performance that you really deserve.
Yeah, it's kind of flexibility at configuration layer versus implementation layer. Let's see, the next is the ecosystem that comes along with SpiceDB. SpiceDB is built by experts that are pioneers in the cloud native ecosystem. So those design principles and kind of interoperability were all kind of always in the back of our minds as we were developing these things. And then a lot of the tooling that is integrated within SpiceDB also have their own ecosystems and are open and kind of growing communities in and of themselves. And SpiceDB also has kind of an ecosystem of tooling and support. So Jimmy already mentioned Zed, which is our CLI tool, which kind of helps you interact with SpiceDB without having to write code. We have an operator that helps you deploy and run SpiceDB and a lot of other things. So you kind of get those for free. Yep. And lastly, and probably the most important, you get to be part of a community. SpiceDB is open source. It's also built in the open. We have kind of the history of development all in our repo. We have issues and contributions being filed regularly from users within the community. And it's a quickly growing community as well. The primary place where a lot of the discussion happens is in our Discord channel, which you can join there. But GitHub discussions and issues are a place where a lot of discussions happen asynchronously. And yeah, I think if you haven't joined already, if you can join, you can get a pretty clear sense of the culture and the vibe within the community through the Discord. So those were maybe more feature level or kind of product level kind of things around SpiceDB. But what do you actually get from SpiceDB in terms of evaluating whether you should build your own permission system or not? It's actually focus. You get to prioritize your own product development. And if anything, you get to build only the authorization related components that matter to you and your development teams. The other aspect is future proofing. Jimmy alluded to this, but SpiceDB schemas can evolve, and actually it frees you up to not get the perfect schema or perfect set of permissions from the get-go. You get to implement something, try it out, validate it, maybe even deploy it, but then realize and evolve your permissions along with your product development. And then in terms of actual usage, SpiceDB can grow with you both in terms of development and as well as performance. And again, it's open source. So you get to pick and choose how you incorporate SpiceDB within your authorization stack. Anything to add, Jimmy?
Yeah, I think one other major aspect that is different from a lot of other authorization solutions is that SpiceDB itself is often deployed as a central service across your business. So that actually lets you kind of lean more into having a dedicated team focused on this, something like a platform team or a security team owning the application permissions layer across your whole business. So they can apply kind of consistent standards across how you're using and securing your applications versus kind of status quo of having custom code kind of sprinkled throughout a whole bunch of different applications at your business and not necessarily having the ability to like wrangle and have oversight across all of those things.
Oh, and then one thing we'll plug is that if the attendees here aren't aware, we have an open source tool called the Playground where you can try out different schemas. There's some examples of well-known permissions, these models that you can click and try and modify. And you can use those and deploy them to your own SpiceDB instances if you're building a proof of concept. But one thing that we want to highlight is that you can actually get a free and direct schema design consultation from an offset engineer. And we'll actually put a poll out to see if you're interested in that. That's something you can schedule and get some feedback on schemas that you're working on, or have an expert kind of give you an initial guide so that you can get started. All right, so then the other end of the decision is what do you get when you build your own? Because there are benefits there too. One is that you get a precise match between the capabilities of your permission system and your known requirements. And known, I put requirements, I preface that with known is because as you're designing your permission system, it goes hand in hand with the product requirements that you have on hand. Of course, you'll have a roadmap for your product, and so you have some future kind of visibility into the things coming down the road, but those are the two things that usually are coupled. But of course, you get to match them exactly. And then you get to match exactly to the development languages that you support internally, the tooling, maybe existing clients. One of the patterns that we see a lot is if you have a legacy authorization system, you can, I guess, reduce the application change service area by supporting like existing authorization client interfaces, for example. So you can do that precisely. And you get to deploy to your supported infrastructure. So if you have a very bespoke deployment setup, you can make sure that whatever system you build fits in and use the exact technologies for that. So what should you consider when building your own? And so these are the list of questions we're going to try to get through. I know it's a lot here, and this is probably where a lot of people's curiosities are going to lie. So again, feel free to answer a question if you have any. Looks like we got one here. It says, how do different teams, before I jump into this, I'm going to read this question just in case we have to answer it now. How do different teams in an engineering org change the schema? Is the schema a single file or multiple files that each team can own?
I can take this question if you want. Today, we actually recommend a lot of folks getting started with SpiceDB stick with having one schema file and having kind of one team that's owning kind of the operations and running SpiceDB as kind of like the owners to code review that while they're kind of going through this transformation of onboarding internal stakeholders like other application teams, other dev teams onto the project, just so that one, that team running it can learn best practices and share those best practices with those teams as they're kind of learning the technology and learning how to integrate it well. But over time, it does become like a point where a lot of folks want to be able to delegate out that access to different teams. And right now, there isn't any first-class support in SpiceDB for splitting up schemas. We do have some users that are kind of just checking in files in different places and then concatenating them together as a part of their CI/CD process. That works to some degree today, but really we have a proposal on the open source project talking about what it would look like to have first-class support for kind of like a module system where you can actually compose and write individual tests for modules that get shared and can be combined and imported to ultimately create your ultimate schema at the end of the day. But today, I think if you're just getting started, I think it makes sense to try to rally around one file and kind of share that knowledge as you build it up over time.
Cool, thanks. Hopefully that answered your question. If not, we can follow up at the end. Okay, we're gonna try to hustle through these questions and make sure we get them all. So first question, when do you need a new permission system? A lot of times that is, I guess, organization dependent, but these are the typical, I guess, events that initiate when you need something new. So it's either consolidating maybe disparate legacy systems. Your existing system doesn't meet new requirements, whether that's performance or functionality, or you're just building something new and it's an opportunity to try something fresh. So that's building in-house, adopting something else. And so, yep. What kind of authorization questions will you be asking? So again, if depending on like what initiated the need for a new permission system, you're probably going to have your own set of requirements that you're building up about why you need a new system. One of them is just complex permissions, and I tried to highlight what that looks like maybe in English form. When something seemingly simple, like can the user access this file, actually becomes that long description, can be challenging to model without, I should say, it's something to consider as you're building out your permission system. knowing that sometimes a single permission isn't as simple as a little bit of business logic. And the other thing is that sometimes permissions actually require request context. So that could be when permissions check is made, it requires things that are only available at the time that the request was made. So when you're building your system, know that sometimes computing permissions answers aren't always static computations. Sometimes they require runtime evaluation as well. Next question is, who will participate in defining the permissions? So Jimmy actually alluded to this in his answer to the question, but what is the actual mechanism for defining what a permissions is? Is it going to be just code that implements the logic for permissions evaluation that's just embedded in your application? Is it a text file somewhere, a YAML file, or some other config file? And then once you have the definition for how permissions are defined, how is that actually applied and stored? And so, yeah, I think the other aspect is, that, again, that was from the question, which is a single platform team going to manage this permissions configuration, or do individual product teams get to define and modify kind of the permissions that apply to them? These are things to think about as you're designing your system. Next is, who will query the permission system? So whether it's a centralized service, whether this is a relational database that you are just making, I don't know, stored procedures calls on, you will have the best idea of how and what clients need to access this. And then and maybe related to that, what protocol they're going to access this over. So the options here are usually some sort of application interface, like a rich client. Sometimes they may be more protocol level. So for example, SpiceDB uses gRPC. If you want to expose things through a known protocol like that. Other times, again, it could be as simple as store procedures in a relational database. But these are things that you can consider as you're building your system interface. What scale are you expecting? And again, scale can apply to a lot of dimensions. The data that's required to compute your permissions that you have to consider, whether they're static data or they are runtime data. You have to model either storing the static data or some sort of transport mechanism to incorporate real-time data. The query patterns that you have. So if you know you're going to have a high kind of request weight in bursts, you'll have to consider that. If these are going to be steady, ongoing requests from maybe non-human users, that may be a different design aspect to consider. And then actually for multi-region, I'll let you talk about this, Jimmy, but I think there are even more considerations that come about when you know you have a globally distributed application.
Yeah, when you have multi-region, there's really a lot of considerations around data consistency, specifically like a lot of distributed data storage has trade-offs in terms of how fresh the data is. And when you're building a security critical system like an authorization system, serving a permissions check with stale data can be a security vulnerability in a lot of different contexts. So being able to have like fine-grained control over the actual consistency and using something that supports multi-region natively is really critical for those use cases. And SpiceDB gives you really good tools around managing the data consistency. So the vast majority of the time you can be using the fastest thing with kind of more flexible consistency, but then only in the scenarios where you really need it do you pay the cost of doing a higher consistency. The other aspect is just fundamentally being able to replicate the data and all the engine and everything that you need to be able to operate in different regions across the world. And SpiceDB is naturally architected in such a way that as long as the underlying data storage is multi-region, you can spin up independent SpiceDB clusters in different regions that don't need to be able to communicate to each other to effectively serve that data and build their own kind of custom caches just to the workloads in those regions.
Next question is, what are the consequences of wrong authorization decisions? And Jimmy already kind of mentioned this, but in a multi-region environment, you can have stale answers, which could be incorrect answers, which could be very critical depending on your application. And so one description of that class of problem is called a new enemy problem. If you Google it, hopefully you land on one of our descriptions of that problem and how SpiceDB solves for it. And I don't think there are any applications that prefer and tolerate wrong authorization decisions, but your application may or may not, and your company may or may not have different tolerances for what happens if something is answered incorrectly. And so we provide validation tools in SpiceDB, but those are things to consider of how you would validate before things are deployed, and also with running systems that your answers are correct and continue to be correct. So it's not just a matter of building the system, but having continual validation of the correctness of the system is also critical.
Yeah, we somewhat implied this earlier, but the critical aspect of validation is that you can check this into a CI/CD workflow and constantly have a guarantee that these validations are being ran across every change that you're going to make to the system.
And lastly, what is this new system blocking? I think this comes down to the primary business question, which is, what do you need to build to unlock what you're actually trying to get? Unless you are yourself a permission system development product company, you're most likely not wanting to build this for the sake of building this. It's building this to unlock a new product functionality, a new service, whatever that may be. And so think about what you're actually trying to accomplish by building this, and evaluate whether it's worthwhile. And then once you get to the point where you have a functional and running system that is serving your needs, of course, we are all builders here, and we know that software is a living thing. So there's ongoing maintenance, new feature development. There's the monitoring of the infrastructure that's running, applying updates, that kind of thing. So consider who's going to own maintaining your system. Is it a team? Is it a volunteer effort? Those are questions that you want to define ahead of time. Otherwise, you don't want your authorization system to be a ignored and decaying system, given that its importance. And then lastly, what should you consider as a company? One dimension to the decision-making process is actually timing. Depending on where you are as a company and the considerations around product, every company needs product, evaluate their product market fit, their business margins, how they're differentiating their product. Is this the right time to focus on building your own system? Maybe not today, maybe it is tomorrow, but that's one thing to consider. And then, of course, the opportunity cost. What do I miss investing in my own product or my own company if I'm spending the time and resources to build a permission system? Which actually gives a third option, which is you can adopt and build. SpiceDB is a kind of a foundational level component for an authorization system. And so you can use SpiceDB for the foundation of different authorization approaches that you may want to experiment with and take. So the flexibility of the schema language allows for experimentation with different authorization models. And one pattern we've seen some users take is just building an abstraction layer on top of SpiceDB in the hopes of maybe swapping out SpiceDB with their own thing later on, but getting off the ground with SpiceDB first. And I know we're right at time, so I'm just going to show these on screen so that they're available. With OSED, once you have SpiceDB running, if that's what you're going to go with, OSED solutions give you a lot of the functionality that surrounds a permission system. So we actually published a blog post today on our company blog that goes into more detail around the lexicon of permissions and authorization. But if you can imagine the permissions system being the thing that defines permissions and evaluates permission answers. And the authorization system is the things that surround the permission system for all the other things that you need in order to incorporate permissions into your application or your architecture. The OSSED OSSED solutions provide a lot of things surrounding SpiceDB. And so I've listed some things here. We could go in quite a bit of depth given that we have Jimmy here on these, but I don't know if that's the best use of our time because I want to leave some time for questions. So I'll just leave this list here. If you have specific questions, you can pop them into the questions chat. And then what do you get with self-hosting? We have users who definitely opt into self-hosting because of different internal requirements. One being just hosting on premises is an actual option. And then we provide some tooling to support that. But you also get to choose a lot of different factors in how you run SpiceDB. And so again, SpiceDB is a kind of foundational component of your authorization solution, but within SpiceDB, there's a lot of tunable things. So you get to pick your own underlying data store. If, for example, if you have internal expertise running Postgres, you can run Postgres as your underlying data store for SpiceDB. And that actually applies to the various data stores that SpiceDB supports. You get to choose your own approach to multi-region. We actually just released read replica support. And so, for example, if you need not necessarily global access to the same, same underlying data relationship data, you can actually have multi-region with different data sources with read replicas. So you get to choose that. You get to choose your own networking. How you access the SpiceDB clusters themselves and how they might communicate with each other behind the scenes. And then obviously the deployment infrastructure. If you have a bespoke deployment setup, you can configure it exactly so that it fits in well with your existing stuff. So one thing we've tried to do when we design SpiceDB is to make sure that the important components are customizable, tunable, and again, being open source, we've had contributions to allow people to contribute back when they've done something that fits their internal systems and then share it back into the community. Actually, Jimmy, is there anything you want to add for this? Because I think this is the last bit.
Not a ton. I do think it's important to note that a lot of these options are actually even configurable on our hosted products. Like we work with you on discovering what your requirements are, even in the cloud environment. So we do deploy into different regions in the same data center as you, for example, with that product. But really, this is for the person who has very strict regulatory requirements. And it's worth them owning the operational cost of running SpiceDB. We've seen some people in different regulatory environments basically opt for this when they can, or if you already have like a very mature operations team that it's not a heavy lift for getting another kind of stateful service running as a part of that team, then we've seen folks often opt for this.
Okay.
Looks like we've got another question.
Yep. Last thing from us, whether you wanted and are interested in a schema consultation, design consultation, or if you just have general questions about OSSED products, or even just running through the exercise of the questions of whether you should build your own or how SpiceDB might be able to accommodate your product requirements, you can schedule a call there. That's just a general page to get in contact with us and schedule a time. So we welcome any interaction through that. And then we'll do some question and answer time. And yeah, we do have a question in the chat. So the question is, does SpiceDB come with an out-of-the-box data store, or is one required to be deployed independently? Technically, it does come with one, which is just the in-memory data store. So the use case of getting SpiceDB running locally and trying things out, or even in a testing environment, you can run SpiceDB with a data store, but that's mainly for non-production use. some more prototyping and testing. But in all other use cases, yes, you do need to deploy an independent data store.
And the open source project comes with a bunch of different drivers for that. So it's not like you have to write any code to implement it. It's more just configuring SpiceDB to point to the persistent data storage that fits your use case.
Oh, we got another question. Can you explain the idea behind SpiceDB Kube API proxy? Does this allow you to use a SpiceDB authorization model to manage permissions for all resources running in a Kubernetes cluster?
I can take this one. I'm actually going to give a talk on this at the next KubeCon. So that's really awesome. Look forward to that one. But the idea behind the SpiceDB Kube API proxy is actually that the Kubernetes API itself has this built-in idea of RBAC, role-based access control. And it actually has a bunch of limitations. And that data is all kind of siloed into Kubernetes itself. But you might have permissions data or a permissions model that doesn't match that exact RBAC model that they have, and data driving it somewhere else. So maybe you have basically logic from your application or from a custom application that IT has built, and you want to delegate permissions from that to make decisions inside of the Kubernetes API to allow folks to access different things based on those permission sets. The Kube API proxy is a thing that sits in between the Kubernetes API and something like kubectl or any other kind of API client of Kubernetes, and allows you to query SpiceDB with those rules that you've created in SpiceDB. And then when access is allowed there, then does it pass the request along to Kubernetes. And we kind of decided to build it this way rather than kind of as a webhook first class into Kubernetes itself, is actually those webhooks come with a lot of limitations, and you can't do things like filtering resources when you go to list resources. So one of the big advantages of the Kube API proxy is that if you say kubectl get pods, we can actually filter down the list of pods just to the ones that you have access to. And this kind of gives you like a very transparent view of Kubernetes without any kind of noise or compromises in terms of what access you actually delegate to folks. And using that, you can have completely custom models. So your models don't have to look anything like the Kubernetes API. They just have to be bridged into it at some point. So that's the idea behind that.
The question, how do the authorization objects map from an authentication context? Does the application need to build the query?
Can take this one too if you want.
Sure.
Cool. So the question was, how do you kind of map the authentication context into an authorization query? There's kind of a couple of things there. SpiceDB lets you model users in any way that you need. And this is actually a key difference between Zanzibar internally at Google, which assumes that users are represented one specific way. But in the real world, users can be pretty complicated. You can have API tokens, you can have JWTs, all these different things. And so we actually let you model this in SpiceDB and create relationships between those objects so that you can always kind of resolve a particular identifier for a user to that ultimate user, and then resolve that to the permission. So often if you're using something like an authentication system that gives you a JWT, you can use the subclaim in that JWT as a unique identifier for the user. And then any claims that you also get out of that JWT, which could be dynamic kind of runtime data, we use a system that we actually collaborated on building with Netflix called Caveats. And Caveats actually let you pass in that context as an argument into a cell common expression language function that you write yourself in the schema. And you can perform all kinds of logic in that. But it is a non-Turing complete language. So we can actually put a boundary on the amount of execution that can be done inside of these functions to guarantee performance out of these queries. So you can't make a policy that is ridiculously long and takes hundreds of milliseconds to complete. So that way you can kind of have guarantees about the complexity of the logic you're actually baking into SpiceDB and baking into the authorization system in a way that it can't get out of control. You can still guarantee performance.
I think we have time for one more questions if we have one. All right, going once, going twice. All right, well, thank you for joining today. Again, we have our Discord community. If you are using SpiceDB and want to ask some questions to the community there, we also have the call that you can schedule. And so, yeah, hopefully we see you sometime soon in the community. Thanks, everybody. Oh, wait, sorry, one more question. We got one. We'll answer this one and we'll end. How do you balance between Cloud IAM and SpiceDB? For example, my application users can purchase access for fine grain, both read and write, access to S3, a PostgreSDB, and to use an existing EC2 instance to run compute jobs. How do you balance writing? I don't know. I think the question might have got cut off, but I imagine it's kind of bridging Cloud IAM and SpiceDB. Yeah. I think this comes. Go ahead, Jimmy.
Yeah, I just say kind of having Cloud IAM rules and kind of using something like SpiceDB are kind of orthogonal topics. Managing your kind of Cloud IAM rules is a topic called IGP. And effectively, SpiceDB is a great foundation for building these tools. And we have a bunch of customers that have built their own tooling in that space on top of SpiceDB, but it's not something that SpiceDB necessarily has out of the box. You kind of have to synchronize the data across these systems to really understand them in a consistent way and build these things. And SpiceDB is a great data store for managing where all that data lives to be able to make these decisions against those APIs and reflect the changes that have been made to them. But I would say if this is a use case you're interested in, basically federation and managing permissions across your cloud provider, that is definitely a great question to bring up in the Discord and have a discussion with other users of SpiceDB that are using it in this way and kind of help you out and guide you along the journey that they have made as well. Anything to add there, Sam?
No, I was going to say, I think as a more general problem, we have some articles around distributed transactions, not necessarily when you're synchronizing between like AWS IAMs, but if, like there's a general class of problems of integrating SpiceDB within an existing application. And so, again, if you search for, I forget the blog post title, but we can add it to the chat after the fact. Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody. We will sign off from here.